super jealous of your outside situation right now.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm not usually
No, it's
away
wonderful.
too. I'm like, ooh, this is nice.
It's so good. I have such an old laptop. I do everything here on my desktop.
Mm-hmm.
I have an old Microsoft Surface from graduate school,
Oh,
and it just doesn't have the bandwidth or the ability to really manage this well.
I just got a MacBook Pro and I do love it. Actually, I didn't have one, but it actually is pretty darn good. And I'm like, oh, I do like this.
Don't tell me that. I don't need to spend money on that.
I know. They're pricey.
No worries. Well, let's dive in here. I think that what we want to do is have a little bit of a protein series. Sorry, not a protein series, a nutrition series, where we break down the different macronutrients. So we'll talk about protein today. Next episode, we'll talk about carbs, and then we'll eventually talk about fats. And we want to try to do so in a way where we really focus on what can we confidently say that we know right now, and make it really actionable for people. How much do we need to be eating of this macro? And what are some really good sources that we know that you should be eating of this macro? And then I think it would also be useful maybe to talk about some misnomers or common misunderstandings in this realm. So on the protein side, I'm sure that, a lot like me and my experience in graduate school, right? Because I spent 3 years in graduate school working on a PhD in nutrition and integrative physiology. And they're still teaching the old food pyramid stuff, and the amount of protein that they're recommending that you eat is pretty far off from the amount of protein that I think that people need to be eating. And there's this misnomer floating around with protein where people say, well, you can't, how dare you eat a gram per pound body weight of protein? You're going to destroy your liver and kidney. I'm like, that's just totally ridiculous. Like, that is absolutely asinine. That is not true. Meanwhile, like, my very overweight professor is up there pounding Coca-Cola and eating like ham and cheese sandwiches. And I'm just like, I just don't know if I really trust what you're telling me. So what I would love to do, and where I would love to start, is on the protein side. Maybe you can talk a little bit about maybe some common misnomers around protein, some typical things that maybe people hear in the media or on the internet. And then maybe we can transition and talk about like how much protein should people be eating on a normal day-to-day basis, right? Because we hear that gram per pound body weight we hear that gram per pound body weight thrown around a lot. And so is that really the number we should be focusing on? Is that in the ballpark? Should we be a little bit below that? Are there times we go above that? So I'd love to just bring some clarity to this question for people.
Absolutely. Protein, I mean, you know how nutrition is. There's always some drama around any given macronutrient in any given year, or honestly, even month. And it's always switching around. And protein has had its fair share of drama. And one of the issues with protein that I think started a lot of this is long ago, in the depths of 80s nutrition, came this concept that protein can damage organs, particularly kidneys. And I think that's where a lot of this started. And just for reference, where this began is that in kidney disease, so any of those, end-stage kidney disease certainly, but chronic kidney disease of any stage, we do have some protein restrictions. Once we're around stage 3 or stage 4, we start restricting protein because the kidney's having trouble filtering many things, nitrogen being one of them. So nitrogen-containing compounds, which do come from protein because there's a nitrogen group on all amino acids. And the kidney can't filter quite a few things when it's ill and when it's malfunctioning. So kidney function declines and we see nitrogen build up, but we also see potassium and phosphorus and sodium build up and all these other things. But really, protein became this major restriction in that disease setting. Somehow, though, that got crossed with protein caused the disease. And that is not accurate. So it's more so that a kidney, as you know, a kidney is diseased. So it's having trouble filtering things. So the nutrition space just kind of picked up some of that concern and carried it. And they carried it far and wide. And protein often gets recommended to be restricted for that reason. I believe also protein has become a drama point in nutrition because of meat. And then the conversation surrounding meat about, is it a carcinogen, the saturated fat, heart disease, all these different things. So protein kind of got tangled. But protein itself as a molecule, as a macromolecule, remains, I think, misunderstood for that reason. But I will say that is also starting to change. So we're definitely even seeing a lot of research that even in a kidney disease setting, they actually might need more protein than we think. They are able to filter some of it. And actually in cirrhosis and liver failure, we actually need more protein than we think. We're even recommending high protein diets now for many of those diseases. So that, I think, is where a lot of that nutrition drama came from. And so we see in those settings, people recommending things like 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. In very ill kidney disease advanced stages, we're saying 0.6. So super, super low protein. But then we have an abundance of evidence now accumulating kind of consistently at this point for years that athletes, especially trained individuals, can go upwards of 1 gram per kilogram, 2 grams per kilogram, very, very high protein intakes, and nothing is happening. So we have to keep in mind, we don't want to take data from sick people, extrapolate it, and put it onto healthy people.
Yes, I think that distinction is incredibly important. So I didn't study nutrition in graduate school. It was part of it, but we really looked at aging, health, and longevity within the oxygen cascade. So respiratory physiology, cardiovascular physiology, muscular physiology, and then you have a good bit of neuro tied in there as well, because the brain kind of oversees and controls almost all of that. Well, not almost, it does oversee and control all of that. Sorry. And I think that sometimes people do make this mistake of not clearly identifying the fact there's an enormous difference when we're talking about a population that has a disease and an illness, and we're talking about a population that is healthy. Disease and illness changes the game entirely with regards to prescription and what we're going to do. And I think that sometimes, as you mentioned, we have things that get tied up in this conversation. It's just an innocent bystander that gets pulled in. And protein seems to be one of those things where it's just gotten muddied into the waters with this conversation and kind of got grabbed as a scapegoat and was mistakenly labeled as, oh, well, protein's causing these problems. When in reality, the story is just, no, like, we have these diseases, and these diseases or populations of people just aren't going to handle higher protein well. Like there's an enormous difference between those two statements and claims. And it seems like protein just, for whatever reason, maybe it is because it's related to the whole meat story as well. Like you have the New York Times posting that red meat is going to cause cancer, which is a whole nother debacle. It just seems like this thing that got pulled into this conversation. It's just trying to hang out on the sideline and be like, guys, don't mind me. I'm just a simple macronutrient over here. And then next thing you know, it becomes this very like weaponized topic and subject. And it's really frustrating to sit on the sidelines and kind of watch that happen.
Absolutely. And we've seen it happen with fat and with carbs. And I think that's something that can get so sticky about nutrition is when we're talking about different types of food, they're so different. So I definitely can give someone a bunch of protein and saturated fat and a highly processed meat with a bunch of sugar also in there. And that's going to be so different than a piece of fish. And those food packages are something that people need to think about a little bit more. The way nutrition is so diverse and the way macromolecules are so diverse. I mean, when we're talking about protein, we're potentially talking about thousands of different things, literally. And that's happened with carbs. And then we see that healthy people who move a lot handle carbs extraordinarily well. So we kind of keep having that problem in nutrition. Exactly. We're giving athletes 400, 500 grams of carbs and their blood sugar is even Stevens. So that's something that's just, it continues to be a struggle in nutrition. So I love to have people think kind of about food packages. The whole meal is a package. How your body is going to metabolize that package is going to be unique to you. The uniqueness about nutrition continues to get lost. So it's just important to keep in mind that these families of food are massive. They're so diverse. There's so many ways to consume protein. And just at that chemical level, protein is very benign. So it's unfortunately been quite misunderstood.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all of that. And so I think when we're thinking about quantity, protein quantity, how much protein should people be eating? And let's just go ahead and say, like, the people that are listening to this podcast in particular are going to be people that are working out, training, high output humans. They want to be strong. They want to put on muscle, lean muscle, right? And they want to be well conditioned and fit. Like, we're talking about people that want to look, feel, and perform at their highest level. And so I think you mentioned, you see like 1 gram per kilogram, and you can definitely go as high as like 2 grams per kilogram. When we're looking at like a very active population, kind of like we have at Rebel, is that 2 grams per kilogram like a good starting point for them? Just like as a baseline of what they should probably be shooting for?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think a very reasonable goal is you can start with 1 gram per pound of body weight. If you don't want to convert to kilos, which is totally fine. But if someone is getting really full on that, I know a lot of athletes, they're actually having trouble getting enough in. So even if you start with 0.8 grams per pound per day, then work your way up to 1. That's absolutely reasonable. That will cover your bases. And also protein, therefore, with that large amount of calories allocated to protein, then you can also consider spreading your protein out throughout the day in evenly spaced boluses, which we know has a lot of benefit for muscle and digestion and things like that as well. So absolutely, I think it's reasonable to, if you're full, start with 0.7, 0.8 grams per pound per day, work your way up to 1 gram per pound of desired body weight per day.
Beautiful. All right, folks, everybody listening, there are the numbers. You have them. That's what we're going to do. And maybe this is a good point then for us to transition and talk more about protein sources. And I think we can kind of piggyback on what you just talked about, what you just mentioned, which is if we have people that are having a hard time getting in that much protein from like a satiety standpoint, they're just getting really full. Maybe we start with some tips and tricks in that realm of like easy ways to get in protein that aren't going to give you that super full feeling, right? Because like you're only going to eat so much chicken breast or so much fish or so much meat. And we'll talk about more of like really good protein sources here in a second. But I just wanted to piggyback on that since we just brought it up. And that's where me personally, I tend to lean and rely on things like protein shakes. Like if I'm low on protein, it's really easy for me to have a protein shake and get in 30 grams of protein, and it's not very filling. And it helps me hit that number, which is great. I handle it well. I digest it well. It's not an issue for me. Things like Greek yogurt can help for me as well. So I think the protein shake for me is really the one that I go to in terms of like, I have my 3 big meals throughout the day, and I kind of know where my protein is going to be at from those 3 meals. And then I make up the difference usually with protein shakes. I'm not sure if on your side, you think that's kind of like the best way to go about managing that fullness and that sensation if trying to get in all, say, like if I want to get in 200 grams of protein purely from whole food, like I just don't like eating that much, to be totally honest, right? And it can be difficult. So I think shakes could be a really good option there for people. I'm not sure if you agree or disagree with that.
Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. I couldn't agree more. And that brings up some things that I think get a little misunderstood about shakes too, because then kind of in those same protein concerns, we hear things like, well, protein powders are really dangerous, right? Or that's processed food. And we hear things like that. Liquid nutrition is an excellent way to get more nutrients in. So if protein is a super filling macronutrient. So if we have that in liquid form, it's literally a little elemental in that sense. It's a little pre-digested. That is easier to digest. It's less filling. So if you were to have that protein in liquid form, that's going to help. You also can absolutely go with dairy products if you tolerate them, like good Greek yogurt or skyr and things like that. You also can do, I'm a big fan of, honestly, egg whites, not super filling. You could do a half cup plus 1 whole egg. So you get the flavor and the wonderful nutrition of the yolk. Not super filling though. They're pretty kind of high volume. So some of those kind of simpler, quick digesting protein sources are fantastic. They have a lot of biologic value also, which is really important for protein. And if it's a good product, a good protein powder, it's absolutely safe to eat. It's just protein. Which is a whole other discussion, but absolutely, I totally agree. Liquid and easy to digest stuff. And also, if you're getting really full, small, frequent meals, you don't have to do huge boluses. Like 60 grams of protein in one sitting is pretty liberal. So definitely feel free to kind of go to those lower grams per feeding opportunity. If you do better with like 30 grams per feeding, just have more feedings. So small, frequent meals is also absolutely fine.
Perfect. Yeah, that's super helpful. For people in the crowd who maybe don't do well with a whey-based protein powder, because like I know I have friends personally that don't handle it very well. I know we have clients at Rebel that don't handle a whey-based protein really well. Do you have any protein powders that you like for people in the crowd that maybe fall into that bucket? Like I know that my wife has used like a bone broth protein before from Designs for Health. I think they have like a pure paleo is what it's called. And it's a bone broth like isolate. And so like you're still getting pretty high quality protein, and she handles that much better than say whey. And then you obviously have like all the pea protein stuff out there. I didn't know if you had like some like top 2 or 3 recommendations for where people could look if they don't handle a whey dairy based protein powder well.
Yes, good question. So, and that kind of brings up a few little tiers of investigative work, because one thing I hear often is an athlete who's not tolerating protein powders will say, I don't digest protein well. Protein makes me sick. And what I'll say to that is protein typically is actually very easy to digest. It's such a low residue item. So protein as a molecule is usually not the problem. What tends more so to be the issue is what protein is coming with. So that can be kind of some of these dairy formulations, or I just have to throw out for all my GI people out there, the sweeteners and emulsifiers that can be in protein powders. So if we do great with chicken or an egg, and then we have a protein powder and we're not tolerating it, and we think, I just can't eat protein, it's probably the formulation you're eating, because the chicken and the egg are doing just fine. So definitely stick with those. So that is just a really, really common misconception. So I want to throw that out there. So it's the formulation. So then to that end, if we're not doing well with dairy-based products, which is not uncommon, no problem. I love egg white proteins. Egg white has 100% biologic value, which is kind of that's really almost the standard of protein absorption that we measure everything else against. So it has this phenomenal nutrition profile where it all gets in, which is actually something to consider for sure. So egg white protein is fantastic. And I also love beef proteins and those bone broth formulations. Absolutely. They're typically really allergy friendly and they digest very well. So something like that also really works. And if someone is more on the vegetarian or vegan side of the house, a pea protein formulation or a plant protein blend can be nice, because you actually do want that blend, because a lot of those plant protein sources are not complete proteins.
Excellent. Okay, so I think that's going to be a really good place for us to transition here to talk more about a protein shopping list for people, right? Like they're going to go to the grocery store this week. They're going to be looking to buy protein. And so would love to just run through kind of like our list of like the big hitters here. And really, I think maybe focus on this biologic, value and availability for people, because that's huge. Like, is it a complete source of protein? So maybe we start with this idea of like, what is a complete source of protein? Just so we have kind of like a baseline understanding of that. And then from there, maybe we can say, and these are great examples of the things that you should be looking to get at the grocery store that fit this bill, right? And then, hey, if you are in the more vegan, vegetarian group, here are some strategies and what you're going to need to do to like piece things together to kind of get this complete source that we're talking about.
Yeah, great question. So with protein, we have the building blocks of protein. Many of you have probably heard this, but they're kind of like Legos, and those are amino acids. And there are 20 that come in the human diet. 9 of them are essential. And anytime you hear the word in nutrition, essential, it means it must be consumed. So, for example, omega-3s and omega-6s are types of fats that are essential fatty acids. We don't make it. So there's 9 essential amino acids that we do not make. We do not have the capacity to move those building blocks around and acquire them. So it must be consumed from food. So the other 11 are non-essential. So we can kind of snap things off and put them back together internally and come up with those other 11. But what we measure protein sources as is whether or not they are complete. So that means particularly they're offering all 9 of those essentials. The complete proteins are typically going to be animal-based. There's also some soy products that are mostly complete proteins, although they have lower biologic value. But other than that, we're looking at dairy products, eggs, chicken, beef, seafood, pork, all of those items, or a good protein powder should be complete. So that will offer all 9 of those essential amino acids. And for all the athletes, because that's what this gang is, something to consider too is that those branched chain amino acids are also essential. And in particular, leucine is in there, which is the amino acid, one of those Legos that we know helps initiate MPS, so muscle protein synthesis. So if we are post-workout and looking to replenish and resuscitate our protein stores and all these different things that we know we need to get into, we want to be in that anabolic recovery state, we've got to make sure we're having complete proteins there. This is something that I see athletes have a little bit of an accidental blind spot with. So there's no leucine in that protein dose post-workout. So that's all an essentiality issue. And really good protein sources are going to have all those complete amino acid profiles. And then the biologic value is referring to how much of that protein we actually end up digesting. So when things are wrapped in a lot of fiber, we don't liberate everything from that fiber matrix. So that's why something like a whey protein powder is so fabulous, or an egg white powder, or egg whites themselves, or eggs, because they're not wrapped in fiber. Those amino acids can get broken down fully and then absorbed. So the absorption process is something to think about as well. And that's what biologic value is referring to.
Excellent. And so we said that, obviously egg whites are kind of like the king of the crop when it comes to this biologic value. And then I think if we were going to think, grocery shopping list here with regards to other complete protein sources that are going to be high in this biologic value, we're looking at the obvious ones like the meat proteins, right? We're looking at chicken, beef, fish, pork. I mean, I love wild game if I can get my hand on it. If I can find, venison, elk, bison, things in that realm. Wondering if you would add anything to that list, or I think that it's pretty simple. Like, it's actually pretty simple at the end of the day. I think people like to make it really complicated, but for the meat eaters in the crowd, for me, that's the list. Obviously try to find things that are going to be leaner. Like, you're not going to want to find the things that are going to be like 15, 20, 25, 30+% fat. Try to find the leaner sources there would be a good thing. But again, I'm thinking like beef, fish, pork, chicken, venison, elk, bison. Duck. The animal proteins. You can't really go too wrong.
Yep, totally agree. Wild game is fabulous. It has a wonderful nutrition profile. So if you or someone you love is an outdoorsman or a woman and they harvest their own proteins, definitely stay in good standing with them, because that's a really nice way to get a lot of protein. My family all are outdoorsmen, so we have a freezer full of a tremendous amount of protein at all times. So that is a wonderful lean source of protein. And yeah, to your list, I think that's everything. The only thing I would throw out there is just something to consider is you can also shop for products that can have those wonderful ingredients and help your cooking a little bit. Because I know one of the big hurdles too is meal ideas. What should I make? Really, really good, like chicken sausage, Italian style chicken sausage, when the ingredients are literally chicken, pepper, basil, onion, something like that is absolutely fine. That can be a nice way to change up some of your meals and your meal prep. So also when something is a little bit more of a product as opposed to just plain meat, many of those are absolutely fine. And they have great ingredients. There's wonderful brands that I give all the Rebel athletes a list of food brands and things like that for that reason. So to help your cooking, also wander into those aisles as well.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I love that. I think it's just, again, that comes back to that food packaging idea, like what's coming with the protein is so important. This is one of the things where, like, when my wife and I eat out, it's really hard to eat out because regardless of how we do it, one, like, protein is going to be the absolute hardest thing for you to find when you eat out because it's expensive. Everybody's going to try to load on like tons of carbs, tons of fat. Like, it is very difficult to eat out and get substantial amounts of protein on your plate. So when I eat out, my goal is to get as much protein as I can on my plate. But the issue that comes with that, coming back to that food packaging idea, is you have no idea how it's cooked, like what oils they're using. And so it's like, while my wife and I love to go out and eat and it's great, it's more like just kind of a night off from us. Cause like I inherently end up like not feeling as good as if I cooked it myself. And it's usually because of like the insane amount of oils and things that are being used in the kitchen at a restaurant to cook the meat. And they're usually not going to be very good oils. And so again, like if you eat out a lot and you're like, man, protein causes me all these problems, it probably has nothing to do with the protein at all. It may just be like the ridiculous like cottonseed oil or whatever they're using in the back that's like slathered all over this piece of meat. So that was just another thing I wanted to like throw in here because I think it's important.
Totally agree. Totally agree. I perfectly said that food package matters so much. And this was something I was thinking about with some of our Rebel athletes the other day. Eating out is really actually something to learn how to navigate. It's honestly a skill. And finding even certain restaurants, or I have like a handful of farm to table restaurants where like I literally know the owner and they put on the menu what they cook with, which oils they use. That's where I eat out. And that's kind of it for me. I'm like, you know what? This is delicious. I'm not messing with it. It's not broken. So it's something to consider too. Where am I eating out? I also like to consider where the protein is coming from. I like to eat a certain way where things are, hopefully regeneratively raised and harvested and things like that. And with a little bit of tricks, you actually can find those. It takes a little bit of hunting and a little bit of education, but just to dig around for sourcing and being careful of where that protein's coming from and what it's served with is a skill, but it's totally worth cultivating because it can make a huge difference in your nutrition.
Without question. And so I think two other things I would love to hit here, and then we'll wrap this thing. Thing number one is, if we have someone listening that is in more the vegetarian or vegan group, and they're like, okay, guys, this is great. You're talking about all this meat and eggs and things like that. Like, what are some options for me on the protein side to still like get in complete proteins, these essential amino acids and things that we've talked about, right? Because our body won't synthesize that naturally internally. We have to get it in externally. So we're thinking about actually like piecing that together, because they're going to have to like kind of Lego puzzle piece this thing together to get it right. If you're not going to eat animal protein, like that's a whole topic in and of itself. Like, if you make that decision, more power to you. Like, I'm not here to judge anything that you're doing. We're here to help. But what are some ideas on how they can approach that realm and still be as successful as they can be? It'll definitely be harder, but I think that there's still some strategies they can use to be pretty successful.
Definitely. It's doable. It just requires a little bit of education, and you got to get a little clever kind of with how you move things around. But I would say a lot of vegetarians are a little bit kind of that lacto-ovo or pescatarian side of the house. If that's you, you're good. You need to just play around with seafood and different dairy products and eggs. If you've got a farm nearby with some really good eggs that you can get, or if you've got chickens yourself, that can make a world of a difference. You're definitely all set. Just kind of use those liberally. But if you are limited where you're not doing dairy or eggs at all, you definitely are going to have to supplement. So a very, very good protein powder might be you might need it twice a day, maybe, not more than once. And so even on non-workout days, you might still need to supplement there. But then you can look at soy products, really good tofu products, tempeh, if you can digest it, and seitan, if you can handle gluten. You'll have to look for some of those products. I will say I do not recommend using any of the meat simulated products. So some of the Beyond sausage sausage and things like that. There's honestly also some like legal issues there. Yeah, big X from James. There's actually some legal issues there. It looks like they may have mislabeled their products and as saying more protein than is actually in them. So there's lawsuits pending. It's also mostly like corn. So just that's not going to be a protein source for you. What you do want to do is use those whole foods if you can. Really good tofu. Get good at baking tofu, sautéing tofu, things like that. Get a very good protein powder in your wheelhouse. You might also benefit from using like some essential amino acids intra-workout, supplementing a little bit there too, I think is reasonable. And also mixing grains. So all my strict vegetarian and vegan friends, you are going to have to build up a fiber tolerance because you definitely need to mix grains, typically like rice. They're not complete proteins, but neither are beans. But if you put those together, you do get a complete protein. So at your meal times, you're going to want to mix things like beans and rice and add in some other vegetables there, chickpeas and sweet potato and quinoa, things like that can work. But just keep in mind your fiber intake is going to be super, super high. So you might need to titrate that up slowly because your protein is coming in these very fiber forward packages. And a lot of athletes feel that on the GI side of things. And then if you're feeling that in training and whatnot, just supplement a little more with a protein powder, pull back on some of that fiber like the beans if you're not doing tremendously well with it, and take it in a smaller dose and build up your tolerance to a higher dose.
Excellent. That's good. I'm glad you brought up the beans because that was going to be my next question is like, where do beans fit into here? Like, because I know that like you hear people talk about, oh, you just eat beans. Like you're going to get so much protein from beans. I'm like, like you get some protein from beans. Like it's not like a protein powerhouse. You know, you got to eat beans in coordination with these other things to actually have a complete source of protein. Like it's more like a carb and a fiber than it is a protein. I think I'm correct in that.
Absolutely. And that you bring up a good point. Again, now we're in a different issue with food packages because I could give you 10 grams of protein with, say, a half cup of beans, a half cup of rice, and it's more calorific than 10 grams of protein from a piece of chicken. So if you're an athlete watching your calories, you're actually consuming more and more calories because the portion of protein for the volume is low because beans really more are a carbohydrate. Same thing with grains and things like that, obviously. And also a big one that I kind of shows up on social media, so I'll mention it in case an athlete in our family has seen this. Macadamia nuts and things like that have a little bit of protein. Same thing, peanut butter. Look at the nutrition label. You'll see calories 190 for 2 tablespoons. Then you'll see fat. It's like many of the formulations, it's like 18 grams, protein 5 grams. That to me is a fat. That's not a protein. So if you are eating macadamia nuts and peanut butter and things like that to hit your protein goals, you're also going to like quadruple your caloric load for the day and probably have some intestinal distress. So just, again, keep in mind those packages. Watch the grams of protein with the grams of fat and carbs and the calories and watch those kind of shift around. So just be conscientious of all of them in those mixtures.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I have a good friend who's a doctor. He's an MD. And we were kind of having this conversation. We were just like catching up the other day. And we were talking about like training and stuff like that because like we're both super, super into it, obviously. And I was asking him, hey, dude, yeah, man, like how are things going? Like he's like, dude, I'm crushing it, man. Like I'm doing such a good job. I'm getting in so much protein. Like I'm eating all these almonds and stuff all the time. And I'm like, dude, that's not really protein. That's fat. It's like, just look at the label. If you just look at the label, like you're getting substantially more fat per serving than you are protein. It's like, how many almonds do you gonna need to eat to have 30 grams of protein? And that's probably going to be like 90 grams of fat because it's like 2 to 3 times as much fat as you getting protein. And so it's like, even at that level, somebody who like is an MD and has spent a lot of time studying human physiology and biochemistry is just like, it's a total misunderstanding of the nutrition basics.
Absolutely. You can see how confusing this stuff gets for everybody. Food is just such its own thing. So practicing looking at labels and just being really conscientious of looking at ingredients in any of those food packages, making sure you're even watching if you're eating. Honestly, there's still peanut butters out there with partially hydrogenated soybean oil. So you go in innocently looking for a little shred of protein and you end up with heart disease or something. So just be careful. These things come in packages that you just got to really investigate fully. So read the ingredients, check the nutrition label for sure. And I always tell people, rule of thumb, whatever the primary macronutrient is on the label is what that food is. If it's mostly fat, it's a fat.
Yes. Okay. The last one I want to hit here, and we might be coming around to this too late because this could be an entire podcast in and of itself, but I would be remiss if we didn't at least touch on red meat and where red meat fits into this conversation, because it is a food source that gets attacked violently. And so maybe we can do kind of like the elevator pitch on red meat and, fix a couple of misunderstandings here with regards to like red meat causes cancer and all this other nonsense. Again, I think it comes back to like packaging concept and like where you're getting that red meat from. But I feel like we just got to touch on it really quickly before we wrap the episode, because it is going to be a huge part of, I think, a well-rounded diet and getting in good protein.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Red meat was one of those victims, again, of early nutrition research and just kind of being a little bit too reductionist, and then also just kind of losing a lot of nuance where it's needed. So red meat, again, just think of the way this can come in so many different forms. So red meat was highly processed at times. And when we look at data where there's concerns over red meat, it's in highly processed red meat products. So we are not talking about your local, or even if it's even from another state, but shipped into you like regenerative lean cuts of steak here. This is very different products. So again, the food packaging, the food product is what matters so much here. And red meat, true, well-raised, holistic, natural red meat is rich in countless vitamins and minerals that the human body needs. Zinc and B12, many, many minerals, iron, heme iron, which is so important for many different parts of our well-being. And what happens is those naturally occurring saturated fats in red meat, depending on the cut, are honestly actually not even super high. So for starters, in a well-raised lean cut of steak, that's not even a major concern per se. But also those naturally occurring fats behave a little differently, really important, than chemically manufactured fats. So when we create a trans fat in a lab, when we hydrogenate an oil, and then we say that that's also in red meat, that chemical is quite different. That trans configuration of the bond is very different than a cis configuration of the bond. And we see these different things in nature kind of showing up differently than how we make them in food processing plants. So natural, well-raised red meat is absolutely a part of a healthy diet. And the other thing I like to think about, as I've mentioned here already, of course, the food package, but also what food is coming with on a plate. So a lot of food works very symbiotically with one another. So we see even there's wonderful compounds in plants that have antioxidant properties that likely neutralize even those small amounts of potentially concerning compounds in red meat. So when we eat that whole foods diet, not only is the food itself working well when it comes in a whole food package, but your whole plate is working well together and synergistically when we eat that way. So we like to see kind of those blends of those whole food fibers, rich in all these different phytonutrients and antioxidants with whole food meat sources. And we can also buy meat that's very ethical and sustainable if we shop around a little bit. And we know that our body seems to do very, very well with those for many millions of years. So we know that we tolerate those well. So just be careful when you see stuff in the news. I always tell people, if it's talking about like hot dogs where you don't even know what's in them, that is not comparable to a well-raised steak.
Yeah, totally in agreement here. I think that a good book in this whole red meat realm for people to read is Sacred Cow, talking about the regenerative raising of cows and red meat, more of how it's actually supposed to be done, as opposed to this ridiculous mass production of red meat where they're shoved into these like tiny little, cages and they can't move and they're just pounded grain and steroids and all this stuff over time. I would highly recommend people pick up and give Sacred Cow a read because I think it's a really important book in this realm to provide I think a better conversation around this topic and sustainable, holistically raised red meat and how that is actually not going to be terrible for the earth and the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a barbed wire topic, as we might say, but actually, it's really important to start learning about these things because the farmers who are transitioning to regeneratively managed productions really need our support. Also, I would say it's really important for consumers to learn about these people who are doing really good work and the way that this science works. For all our friends who like ecosystem science, obviously, food is a huge component of that as well. There's a lot to that. That could probably be its own episode. But if people are just wondering what regenerative means, I will just explain that statement super quick because this is different than organic. Regenerative likely is also going to need label regulations soon because this is coming soon to a theater near you. But regenerative management is when we move livestock across grasslands in a way that they naturally do in nature. A really quick, perfect metaphor for this is honestly the American West. Those grasses are drought-resistant prairie grasses that grow when they are bitten into, trampled over, and left alone when bison moved through them. So bison move naturally, so do cattle and other ruminants. They feed on grasses and move through, and they don't double bite, as you might want to think of it. They bite once, move through, and keep moving. They move because one, they've soiled that grass, but two, they also get moved by predator pressure. So if we look at that and how that works in a natural ecosystem, that actually improves the health and the growth of drought-resistant grasses that hold together soil and topsoil, and it actually becomes a net carbon sink. So farmers are starting to do this in production by moving ruminants through pasture in a very particular manner where it's actually promoting grass growth and topsoil development and carbon sequestration. So these farms are doing hard work. It's good work. It's fantastic science. So I do like to mention this to people because these farmers need our support. So if you want to nerd out about where your protein comes from, that I'll leave it at that. That's something to consider.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that the regenerative agriculture movement is incredibly important. And people need to go out of their way to read and learn more about it and try to find people in your area that are doing it and support them.
Agreed.
But Aaron, we are at 42-ish minutes here. This has been fantastic. I hope that everyone listening has enjoyed it as much as I have. And so thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. And we will continue this talking about fats, talking about carbs, and trying to bring you a very nice, well-rounded conversation. And I think a field that gets a little bit tribalistic sometimes.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I hope today everyone got a little something out of this protein talk that you can take with you. Breaking down these macronutrients, there's a lot to it.
Absolutely. Have a fantastic week, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.